In our third lecture for the week, we'll be looking at the Mexican-American experience, the history of the annexation of the U.S. Southwest, U.S. policies on immigration and labor, and Mexican-American cultural resistance. It's always important to begin with history. In the 1840s, the young nation of the United States consisted of states and territories east of the Mississippi. These areas were full of a teeming population, often of immigrants from Europe who were hungry for farmland, and migrations into the Louisiana Purchase began west of the Mississippi and beyond. Now, in the mid-19th century, Mexico was far larger than it is today, as you can see on this map. It stretched all the way from Central America up into what we think of today as Oregon, and halfway from the Pacific to the Mississippi. This area was populated with native peoples and a light smattering of Spanish Mexicans. The northeastern portion of Mexico was particularly lightly populated, and increasingly Anglo-Americans, with the permission of the Mexican authorities, began to migrate and to settle in a region that we call today Texas. Between 1835 and 36, the so-called Texican Revolution against Mexico took place. And then, in 1840, the Republic of Texas was annexed into the United States. The northwestern portion of Old Mexico was what we call California, and it consisted largely of coastal areas which were centered in Spanish Catholic missions. But some of the port towns became increasingly prosperous, especially San Francisco, and there were immigrant populations of Europeans, for example Russians, and Americans. In 1846, an uprising of Anglo-Americans led to a brief proclamation of a republic, and then a territory governed first by the U.S. military and then quickly annexed as a state. In 1846, the United States went to war against Mexico, and at least part of the reason was that the nation needed more land. As a result of this war, the United States annexed New Mexico, Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, Utah, Wyoming, and Oklahoma, a huge portion of what we think of today as the United States. Now, we've said that when a migrant people moves into a region already populated, the question is, which group will become dominant, the immigrants or the people already living there? Schaeffer points out that in this case, many Mexican citizens became aliens in the United States without ever crossing a border. In the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the promise was that Mexican citizens would be able to preserve their language and culture and their religious liberty and to retain their property. But these promises were broken, and Schaeffer discusses a pattern of second-class treatment that emerged well before the 20th century. People who became Mexican Americans became outsiders in their own homeland. As we see in the film for the week, U.S. racial ideology was applied not only to Native Americans and African Americans, but also to the citizens of the area that had once been Mexico. Mexicans became defined as inferior, a mongrel race, no better than Indians, and the same racial reasoning was applied to them. Now, you cannot understand the relationships between Anglo and Latino Americans on both sides of the border without understanding that Mexican Americans are primarily seen as cheap labor. American businesses, says Schaeffer, with the support and cooperation of affluent Mexicans, have used Mexican people when it has been in corporate interests. The result has been a cycle of shifting labor geography. When the production facilities are in America, Mexican laborers are pulled north of the border. For example, the migrant agricultural workers who work on the fields in California and Texas. When production facilities are in Mexico, then Mexican laborers are expelled from the United States or employed in their homeland south of the border by American-owned companies. The perpetual driver of this cycle is American corporate interests. In a history of troubled Anglo and Mexican relations, Rodriguez and Vincent explained that the President of Mexico in the late 19th century took cash to encourage emigration in response to U.S. corporations' desire for cheap labor. For example, in 1920, a Colorado beet company paid $360,000 to Diaz for 13,000 Mexican workers. He also sought to industrialize Mexico, plants and operations in Mexico for U.S. corporations, there where the labor was cheaper. This, of course, left American workers without jobs. The quotation is that U.S.-based corporations have no recognized border. U.S. immigration policy has always accommodated corporate needs for cheap labor. Then, in the 1920s, when 500,000 Mexican immigrants were recruited for cheap labor on cotton and produce farms, a political battle arose, which just might sound familiar to you today. U.S. nativists used racist terms to argue for restrictions on the importation of labor. One Texas congressman said, "The word Mexican indicates race." Unions objected to cheap peon labor. Employers, on the other hand, defended Mexicans using racist stereotypes. They said, well, they're docile, lazy, stupid, and inferior. One cotton grower said, never was a more docile animal than the Mexican. The political stalemate was broken in the 1930s, when the relative prosperity of the 20s was replaced by a massive depression in which unemployment and poverty levels reached sky-high levels. Of course, in a context like this, immigrant workers were particularly resented, and a program of repatriation was begun in which Mexican workers were deported, including people of Mexican descent born in America, possessing American citizenship, being deported nevertheless. Circumstances changed again in the 1940s. World War II broke out, and large numbers of American young men entered the military and were absent fighting the war all around the world. Well, of course, this produced a labor shortage, and Mexican workers were once again in demand. So the Bracero program established a temporary worker status for Mexican migrants. This continued into the 60s, long after the labor shortage of World War II had vanished. Why? Well, they were a continuing source of cheap labor. But when labor unions became particularly active in the mid-60s, this program was repealed. And in this cycle, we see workers alternately recruited and expelled as employers' needs and politics fluctuated. The constant in all of this is that Mexican labor has always been exploited by United States business interests. The variables are time and place. Mexican workers have been imported, and they've been expelled as economic threats. Production facilities have been located in the U.S. and exported to Mexico. This is the context in which we should view U.S. immigration policies with Mexico. Please notice that there were no immigration policies until the 1960s, and we'll be looking more at this next week. But immigration for Mexicans has often been a two-way street. They have migrated to the United States for jobs, often temporarily, maybe for the day, maybe for a brief picking season, and then they might return to their home. Or they've been repatriated home, possibly by choice, often by force. This back and forth pull and push has been driven by fluctuations in economic conditions, corporations' need for cheap labor, and nativist politics based on fear of job loss. When most Americans think of Mexicans, they think of immigrants. But even the ones not born in the United States could be seen as migrants. Daniels, in his History of Immigration in America, interviewed a Mexican migrant who arranged to be deported every fall for 30 years. Citizens of Mexico work in the United States, and sometimes they work in Mexico. Mexican President Zedillo, at the end of the 20th century, said that his country would not tolerate foreign forces dictating and enacting laws on Mexicans living in the United States. On the other hand, President Vicente Fox recognized that Mexicans live in both countries, and he called for a comprehensive agreement that would make it easier for Mexican workers to get work visas and secure permanent legal status. Mexican-American cultural identity is very much transnational. Like many minorities living in a dominant culture, Mexican Americans struggle to sustain their cultural traditions. In the La Raza movement, Latinos affirmed their pride in their culture and identity. Schaefer describes hometown clubs, Mexican American associations in various United States cities in which the members sustain close ties with people at home and support in each other a maintenance of Latino culture. Cesar Chavez was a labor leader and activist in the late 1960s. He organized the United Farm Workers Union to improve conditions for migrant workers. In our own day, we see growing political activism on the part of America's largest minority. In our day, America is split down the middle with political ambivalence centering on Latinos and Mexican Americans. On the one hand, we have nativists who demand closed borders and aggressive border control policies. This movement in 1986 led to laws which criminalized the hiring of undocumented immigrants. But those laws are almost impossible to enforce. Business interests demand inexpensive labor, and they're constantly undercutting strict immigration policies. Employers are rarely prosecuted for hiring undocumented workers. Okay, let's step back a bit. Livermore, in his concept of cultural intelligence, identifies the first step of the process, knowledge CQ, that is, understanding another culture cognitively, learning of other cultures, learning how they view us, learning their culture's role in shaping perspective and behavior, what Livermore calls an honest understanding of how my cultural background truly shapes who I am. Of course, the challenge is when one culture encounters another, especially when one is dominant and the other is subordinate. How, for example, might mainstream Americans view Mexican Americans? Why do they always seem so stuck? For example, everybody else goes to the doctor. Why do Mexican Americans lock themselves out of health care, as Schaefer describes in 232? Sometimes, he says, they rely on a tradition of folk medicine. Well, isn't that pretty backwards, culturally inferior? And how about the fact that they don't seem to achieve at the same level, educationally or economically? But what if we view these issues with an open mind to learning about Mexican American culture? For example, Schaefer describes familism, He says this is pride and closeness in the family, a culture which raises children so that family obligations come before individual needs. The positive of this is that the extended family acts as a support structure. Life challenges, age and disease, experiences of discrimination. The negative side of this is that it could, in some cases, discourage talented individuals from achievement if they have to stay home to take care of the family. If we apply a little intercultural knowledge and sensitivity, these issues can seem quite different. Consider Mexican Americans being locked out of healthcare institutions. Well, Schaefer says a lot of that is due to the fact that they don't trust those institutions. In fact, they don't really trust any mainstream institutions, and they have good reason for that because of all the discrimination that they experience. Or consider the issue of aspiration and achievement. The fact is that young Latin Americans aspire to higher education at a higher rate than do young white people, but they don't achieve at very high rates. This is true for many reasons, but some of them are cultural. American mainstream culture, as we've said, is extremely individualistic. In a family, young people are expected to leave the home and to go out and achieve something. By contrast, Mexican culture is highly communal. Schaefer describes familism as obligation to the family before the individual. So a young person is raised to value the family above everything. Now consider an academically talented young Mexican American student who goes off to college and then is called home because the family needs him or her. And the person goes. Is this exasperating failure, which is how mainstream values would look at it, or is it loyalty to an admirable core social value? The danger of intercultural judgments is that we do so without knowledge. We judge members of another culture by our cultural standards, and we often miss the challenges that minorities experience trying to thrive in an alien world. Here are some of the sources that are cited in this presentation.